Hello and welcome back to another episode of the EMS On Air podcast. My name is Jeff Lassers. I'm a professional firefighter, paramedic, EMS instructor, content creator, and podcast host. EMS On Air is co-hosted by Dr. Robert Dunn, who is the EMS medical director for the Detroit Fire Department, as well as the Detroit East Medical Control Authority. Together, Dr. Dunn and I are here to educate and inform EMS professionals with practical knowledge and real-world experiences. This EMS On Air episode is also available as a free CAPCI-accredited EMS continuing education course hosted by GuardianCME.com. To access the course, follow these simple steps. First, go to GuardianCME.com. Then, log in or create a free account. Then, click on the Continuing Education section. Search Cyanide or type the episode name in the search bar. Then watch the entire course and complete a brief 10-question post-course quiz. That's it. It's that easy to earn your EMS continuing education credits with EMS On Air and Guardian CME. In our last episode, we broke down the dangers of smoke inhalation, focusing on the toxic effects of cyanide and carbon monoxide poisoning. We discussed the importance of being prepared to treat smoke inhalation injuries and highlighted life-saving treatments, including the use of hydroxocobalamin for cyanide toxicity. This episode serves as a follow-up, diving deeper into cyanide poisoning, but with a twist. This time, we will explore a case study of a cyanide exposure in a firefighter, not due to smoke inhalation, but through a different, yet equally dangerous route. Today we are joined by Doug Burke, a retired battalion chief from the City of Lansing Fire Department, who currently serves as a regional trauma coordinator for the state of Michigan EMS system, and is also an adjunct EMS instructor at Lansing Community College. Doug will share his personal experience with cyanide toxicity during a structure fire, despite wearing full protective gear and a self-contained breathing apparatus. Doug's story uncovers the hidden dangers firefighters face in modern fires and underscores the importance of early symptom recognition. He will take us through his journey from fighting the fire to experiencing severe cyanide poisoning, providing crucial insights for both firefighters and EMS professionals. We will also touch on the importance of preparedness and treatments like hydroxocobalamin that can make a difference in saving lives. As always, we would love to hear from you, so please send your questions, comments, feedback, and episode ideas to the EMS On Air podcast team by emailing us at Jeff, that's Geoff, at EMSonAIR.com. And don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform and leave us a rating and a review. Thank you, and enjoy the episode. Good afternoon. How are you guys?
Doing good, thank you.
Excellent.
Well, Doug, kick us off. Who are you? What do you do? And where do you do it?
So, Doug Burke, I am a retired battalion chief from City of Lansing Fire. I am also a adjunct instructor for EMS at Lansing Community College, and I am currently in a role of State of Michigan Systems of Care Trauma Coordinator.
So you're here to talk about cyanide poisoning, and unfortunately, you experienced that. In our last episode, Dr. Dunn and I talked about fireground resuscitation. We may encounter victims of smoke inhalation, and in most circumstances, our conversations talks about the citizens that we care for. But unfortunately, once in a while, a first responder is the one who is in danger. And although you didn't have smoke inhalation, your experience at a couple of fire incidents in one shift led you to a cyanide toxic state. Is that correct?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, it was mostly the initial fire scene that I made that day.
Okay, so give us the story. What happened?
It was August 4th, 2016. Call came in for a commercial structure fire around 5:15 p.m. I was on the initial truck that arrived. We got there. We had heavy black smoke showing from multiple sides of a 125,000 square foot old masonry 3-story elementary building.
Do you know what it was being used for at the time?
At the time, I'm not exactly sure. I know what some of the businesses were prior to, but we had no idea who was in there or what was in there at the time. So
nightmare situation for a fire department that you have this massive structure with Lord knows what's in that thing, and now it's on fire.
And luckily enough, it was still daylight out. It was midsummer, so still daylight, so we had that to work for us. But as the first incoming truck, I ended up getting assigned to search. We went in. It took us a long time. The smoke was so black and thick that even flashlights didn't give us any visibility. So it took a bit for us to find the seat of the fire. And even after finding the seat of the fire, we didn't really know what was burning at that time. So after quite some time on scene, we finally figured out that what it was that was burning was the old school pool filled in with foam blocks, because one of the businesses that occupied that building over the years was a gymnastics training facility. So once we had gotten the seat of the fire, understood what it was, it took us nearly 4 hours to get it completely put out. Total time on scene was 6 hours to do the extinguishment, the overhaul, and not only the size of the building, but the elements, the outdoor elements were extremely hot. It was 95 degrees that day.
Nice Michigan summer days where it's like 900 degrees and the humidity's over 100%.
And we're inside a brick building that's nothing but an oven.
And by the way, it's burning petroleum-based products at an extreme high rate of heat. It's sucking up oxygen. It's giving off massive amounts of gas. Poison.
And we're talking about a school pool.
Right, I was going to say.
So this is a good-sized pool. This isn't some small pool that they'd filled completely with foam blocks.
Yeah, exactly. It was.
Wow.
And I can picture it. You go to these gymnastic studios, and there's these really cool, you jump in foam blocks so nobody gets hurt. I can picture it, but like a competitive swimming pool full of fire load. Okay.
Looking at some of the pictures that I had seen through the fire marshal's division after the fact, there were other rooms that had some of those blocks that had been cut up but just not put into the pool as well. So the fire load was extreme. And we didn't really give much heed to the fact that it was cyanide. We just put the fire out. But we did end up having to rely on a lot of mutual aid just because of the extreme heat. We had 2 to 3 folks that were transported to the hospital off the scene with what was thought to be heat exposure as well as dehydration. In that 6 hours of me being on scene, I went through probably 4 to 5 tanks with my crew, always taking the rehab cycles in between. And you didn't really have a choice at that fire. I mean, it was so hot and so much work that you wanted to take that break for a few minutes and get something to drink. It was probably around the 9 o'clock hour or so I started to recognize that I had headache and nausea.
And at this point, you're off scene, you've cleared?
No.
Okay, so you're still on scene, you're starting to feel like this.
Yeah, I was there start to finish, which the call came in at a little after 5, and our last rig, we went off scene at 23:30.
Okay.
So we were there a long time.
So what was the first symptoms you felt? Like all of a sudden, obviously you're in the heat. We've all felt those heat cramps, those hard fires, like you gut it out. So I can totally see just being like, I'm just dehydrated. I probably didn't eat right. I got a headache. I probably didn't, all those things.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Right.
Nausea and headache was what I started to have.
Right. And as Dr. Dunn's told me, the first thing you're going to see is those neurological assessments. Headache, nausea, I'm feeling dizzy, all these things.
I felt like I stayed hydrated well enough. And after we were able to clear that fire, I got back to the station and my head was hurting pretty bad. I remember making a phone call to my wife real quick and letting her know that, hey, I wasn't one of the few folks that had gotten transported in. I'm doing good. However, I've got this extreme headache and nausea, and so I just need to go to the car and get my son some Tylenol and rest. I was back at the station maybe 15 minutes, and we got called out for another apartment fire on the south end of the city. And from the north end where I was stationed all the way to that fire scene, the siren was just piercing. I mean, my head hurt so bad that the siren felt like it was just going to...
Was this before the headset days? You were saying 2010? So yeah,
this is 2016.
2016?
We had headsets, but they didn't get used.
Right. Now I love them. Now I can't imagine not wearing them. But yeah, back in the day, we didn't. Come on.
Yeah, so thank goodness they made a good aggressive attack on that fire down there. It was room of contents, and the battalion chief cleared us. So we were able to go back to the station. And by the time I got back to the station, my symptoms had even worsened. The nausea, the headache, the lights were starting to bug me. I didn't really give it a lot of consideration because I've had a history of migraines since I was a young kid. And I felt like I just needed to rest. I mean, 6 hours of nothing but work in those temperatures. So I remember getting back to the station after that call, and somebody telling me, I think it was an off-duty battalion that had come in for that fire, was still in our office area, and he says, "Man, Doug, you look terrible." I'm doing okay, you know. So even at then, I was still denying the fact that I needed some help.
Right.
And I remember going to the bathroom thinking to myself, "Oh, I just need to go to the bathroom." And I walked back from the bathroom into the office. I plopped down in a chair and I looked at him and I said, "Take me wherever you got to take me. I can't do this anymore." It was that bad. So that was a moment that not only myself, but there was another officer that was at the station, was on scene as long as I was. He was on our engine company from the downtown station. He was lost in the station. The crew was looking for him because he was exuding the same symptoms, except he was found down in the parking structure, which is beneath our station, and his neuro was not intact. He didn't know where he was. His symptoms were probably a little worse than mine when you compare those two things. They found him. They loaded both of us up, got ready to take us to the hospital. My crew that transported me talked about the cyano kits. Our department had cyano kits on the hazmat unit as well as the command car. And they discussed it, but I think the reluctancy to administer it was because they just didn't know what the side effects would be from doing so.
It's one of those things we don't do often enough where you're so comfortable. Like, how many times you've given fentanyl where you're like, I know exactly, you're not uncomfortable with it, but here's a drug. I haven't given it ever. I don't remember if there's a side effect or not, right?
And it's one of your own.
It's my buddy.
Yeah.
I work with him every day. I'm really not going to mess this up, which makes it harder to pull the trigger.
Yeah, for sure.
People are comfortable with it. Acute at a fire scene, you pull someone out that's in respiratory arrest, it's kind of right at the top of your list then. But this kind of, deterioration, even though we talk about it, sometimes people aren't really thinking about it or ready to pull the trigger on it.
Yeah, and I believe that was probably the circumstance for me because neither one of us got it administered. But the other thing, too, was we were literally 2 minutes from the hospital.
Yeah, the 2-minute itis will stop any medication from being given. Yeah, if you could see it, if I could smell the hospital, I don't need to give you that.
I always like to say there's no such thing as a proximity protocol.
Right. No, and you're right. I mean, the bottom line is the quicker you treat somebody, the better off they are. You still go into a hospital, you got to get registered. You got to see by a nurse. They got to see by a doctor. Then they got to write us in. So it does save so much time, even if you're in the parking lot to do these things. But I get it. I've been there a million times.
Sure.
Just take him, doctor. What's wrong with him?
So here they're taking you to the hospital. What's happening?
So thankfully, my buddy he had the wherewithal to grab my phone and call my wife because I couldn't speak at this time. I mean, it hurt too bad to even think, let alone talk. And so I say thankfully because that got her there much, much quicker than what she would have if I would have had to try to reach out. And so I get to the hospital. I'm in a room. Of course, I get seen by the doc, the nurse. Photophobia, the nausea, the pain was so much that, I think I had a pillow over my head just to try to keep that all from soaking in. But I do remember that my wife was there and she was actually talking with the physician. And I recall them talking about, well, we think we're going to have to transfer him to Kalamazoo to the hyperbaric chamber. And in that moment, I thought to myself, I not once was ever off air. I always went in with full PPE. So I knew I didn't have a CO exposure. So when the next nurse come in, and it happened to be a buddy of mine that I knew, I told him, I said, "Hey, I think this is CN, man. I think this is cyanide." Never got any hits of smoke. And
you've been out of the fire for a long time, getting worse.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, so by this time, we're talking 1 a.m. So a few minutes later, he comes back with a cyano kit, hangs it, and administers it. And then within maybe 2 hours or so, I started to feel like the symptoms were subsiding and I was able to talk and felt somewhat normal again and didn't think I was going to die.
Oh, wow. That's pretty crazy. So it's really important to point out, you never entered that building or got near it enough without an SCBA.
Never.
Right. So Doc, how did he get the cyanide?
So that's exactly what we're talking about a little bit before, is that you can absorb it through your skin, right? This is part of when we think of modern fire, and this is an extreme example of a fire that you were really dealing with completely, petroleum-based plastics in this fire. But those plastics are a component of every fire that's out there now. And, and I think it's good advice to think of every fire as a hazardous materials scene. And there are a lot, and we're just talking about a couple of the chemicals that are in complex modern smoke, but there are things that you absorb through your skin. So you've got bunker gear covered with it. You're hot, you're sweaty, and you're in an environment where you're going to absorb a lot of cyanide through your skin.
Yeah, that's the only thing that I could attribute it to was an absorption exposure, because, of course, our clothes inside our gear was completely soaked. I mean, the entire time, that temperature, I don't think ever really went down below 90 the entire time we were there. Maybe around that 11:30 mark when we finally cleared scene, but I can guarantee you my uniform was soaked the entire time. I assume that it had to have been an absorption exposure.
And you're still off-gassing materials off your bunker gear and things like that. Obviously, this is risks we talk about for more than cyanide with firefighters, including a lot of the carcinogens, and why it's important to decontaminate bunker gear immediately, get changed, get a shower, change your hood.
Yeah. We did have a formal rehab on scene. We had that set up. So vitals were being taken for anybody that might have had any kind of symptoms that brought them over to the medic crews. And I never was exuding those symptoms to that extent to where I needed to go and have an assessment. Although I think that it definitely made me realize as I progressed, I was a captain at that time, as I progressed into the battalion chief role, that having the cyano kit readily available is imperative for not only just ourselves, but even the victims that we might pull out of these buildings. And so our department made it a policy to purchase and put those cyano kits on every ambulance so that it wasn't just relied upon on the command car to have it or have it sitting in a hazmat rig. Didn't even get to the scene.
That's a really smart way to do it, because you want to make sure you have it where you need it, when you need it. And I really think that it's firefighters, fire-based EMS that has a lot of the expertise in these cases. And last time Jeff and I talked about this, we talked about a patient that actually went through a similar experience. Patient had some smoke inhalation, had some exposure, had a little bit of CO, but not much, was somewhat acidotic, was pretty good mental status when they pulled the patient out of the fire. Didn't really meet any indications for initial treatment, was transported to the hospital, and then after being at the hospital for a while, started to deteriorate. Similar kind of experience that you had, right? So there's materials on the skin that are still being absorbed. The distribution of the cyanide is still happening, and the patient exhibits delayed toxicity. And that's something that clearly you experienced as well as your colleague with neuro changes. And that is some of the classic symptoms: headache, confusion, that not being able to talk.
And having been through it as a patient, it made it real simple for me to say that if there was any question, just give it, that there's no adverse effects from it. I mean, when I urinated, it was purple for a
sure.
couple weeks.
Yeah.
I hear you. It's like you ate a bunch of beets for a month, huh?
Yeah, it was,
Yeah.
What about your skin? Did you turn all red and everything else?
No, not that I recall.
Okay.
Yeah, some people definitely turn pink. It can interfere some with laboratory tests. So we clearly want to have indications for using it, but that change in mental status, that's the classic indication, obviously respiratory cardiac arrest, but doing that assessment and reassessment of both firefighters and fire victims to look for those kind of symptoms. And that's really important. Obviously, they do some tests at the hospital. Those take a while to come back. Probably the first thing we might find is that someone has an acidosis on a venous or arterial blood gas that we can't explain. That makes us worried. But actually getting a level back, by the time you get that back, you should have already treated the patient most of the time.
Right. And I think that you're pointing out a good point there, is that we need to presume that this patient has reached some toxic levels at some point, because we can't get, total confirmation. So in the field, Doc, when I'm recognizing these symptoms, he was in an environment and then you have these symptoms. Walk me through, after I've recognized those, what other initial assessment findings and initial treatment should I be doing for anybody in Doug's situation?
Well, I think you want to be considering all the options that are out there, right? So good supportive care, right? You probably are a little dehydrated, which is going to make it worse, right? So I want to provide good supportive care, get you on the monitor, get a 12-lead EKG. If I have a non-invasive CO, which some people have on their monitors, so they can clip a finger probe on and get carbon monoxide, at least a ballpark level. I want to go ahead and treat with high flow O2. I want to get that IV in you, get you some fluids, and start, based on your symptoms, prepare the cyanic kit. If you're really having altered mental status, you've got a decreasing GCS, you were at least at that confusion level, it sounds like. Probably you were sitting there with your eyes closed as well, I would guess, because you felt so terrible. But get all of those things going while I'm going to get you ready to transport to the hospital.
Yeah, I think that was a good lesson learned for at least myself as a up and coming shift commander, that if there was any question, we were just going to give it. The symptoms of a headache or the nausea, that if it was one of our own, we just give it en route to the hospital. The message that really needs to be conveyed across the fire service is that to think about it and not have it doesn't help anybody. And
Right.
spend the money, have it as a tool in the toolbox. It's likely that you're going to give it to a victim before you're going to give it to one of your own, but it's just as likely that one of your own are going to need it. We had some folks in our hazmat side of the house that really pushed for the cyano kits. They really understood that every fire is a hazmat. And, the tough fireman mentality was, I don't need that. My helmet's a badge of honor and I don't need to wash it, and all the things that go along with being a fireman. And so I do think that the cyano kit is certainly worth its value when you have somebody like myself going through that.
Yeah, and thank goodness for those hazmat guys having the same in my system. It always comes from the hazmat guys. You nerds, I love them. I say that with true love.
Well, I think a lot of that comes out of the education that's out there for hazmat, totally. Right? There's a national curriculum and a big focus on so many components of smoke are hazardous, and not just acutely like this. I mean, we're not getting into some of the other risks today, but all of the carcinogens that we're concerned about in firefighters and the increased risk of cancer in firefighters. And again, that knowledge base to be a good advocate. The other thing I wanted to touch on is, you're talking about your rehab and everything else. I think that's really important. I think some fire departments maybe aren't putting the resources into that, making sure people are staying hydrated, doing some vital sign checks, asking some of those questions about symptoms. And having a good rehab policy and procedure, I think, is vitally important.
Oh, I agree. Thinking back on that scene as well, we had, if not one, maybe two catabuses that were on scene for the cooling effect, and that's where they were trying to keep the hydration stuff. We had our maintenance department that brought our air trailers out, and they were trying to give swap out hoods and gloves and anything that they could do on scene. So it was a major fire, mostly because of the elements that we were up against, not because it was this raging city of Detroit type fire.
And it wasn't that you didn't have the proper equipment. You had all the right people, you had all the right equipment, you had all the right safety devices, and still you're encountering. Imagine being a system that couldn't handle that amount of volume of fire, logistics, having cooling. Some departments like cooling. You mean like the wind?
Yeah, for sure. It was not considered a large fire to us.
Sure.
It was just a large battle to us.
Yeah, you're right, because it always depends on what's on fire. Not even always how much of it's on fire, but what's on fire. When you're dealing with, what are we talking cubic feet there? When you're talking about how many cubic feet in a high school swimming pool and then fill it with poisonous material when you light it on fire.
It's an extreme example, but obviously the contents of every room are mostly some kind of plastics, engineered wood that has a lot of plastics in it. I mean, that's what we're really encountering these days in every structure.
Right. And on a room of content fire where you're in and out in 20, 25 minutes, you're not getting that exposure level.
Exactly.
On a 6-hour ordeal with 95-degree temperatures, it
might as well have been a gas fire or oil fire. It might as well have been an oil rig on fire standing right next to it.
I do want to ask Dr. Dunn about the blood value that you guys would get at the ED, and how does that correlate to the patient?
Well, I think anytime we're looking at any toxin, whether it's cyanide or CO or ingested toxins, that one blood value you have to put into context. You always have to put that into context, in terms of when the last exposure was, what kind of exposure was there. And for you, this is complex, right? You were absorbing it through your skin. It could have been any point in the fire. You started to absorb it. You're hot, you're sweaty, your pores are open, right? It's the perfect way of absorbing toxins through your skin, even with perfect respiratory protection. So, And then what happens after the fire? How close are you to your bunker gear if that's off-gassing some materials? Did you wash? Did you change everything out? Did you put the same stuff on when you went to the next fire?
I did, yeah.
Because those are all going to add to how we interpret that number. And then one number is just one number kind of in that time and space. And usually what we're looking at is serial measurements, but you had a blood value, I think you said was in the 70s. And, obviously any amount of cyanide in your bloodstream is not good.
To kind of like get a little summary and a little bit of learning lessons from everybody else, when we encounter people that were in an environment where smoke was there, even if they didn't inhale something, absorption and just the exposure to those toxins can have an impact on them. So we can't just cancel it out because we were wearing PPE is what I'm saying. Right. So
absolutely,
it's one of those things we got to have a mindful. It's like, hang on, it's more of the symptomology and the environment they were in that should help me to, deduce down to what things could be or might not be.
And if you're worried, like you're thinking about carbon monoxide, you should be thinking about cyanide always.
Yeah, I was going to point that out. We focus on cyanide in this with Doug, but at the same time, we're just making sure to really pump them full of oxygen too, to, presuming that he's had the cyanide poisoning because of the situation that he was in. We've probably also had the CO poisoning as well.
Well, he probably didn't because he was wearing his respiratory protection and he was in and out of the environment appropriately. You didn't have a bottle run out. You didn't have any of the classic concerns that you would have. But when you're thinking about someone, a victim who you're pulling out of that fire, you're certainly always thinking about both. But I think we're definitely putting you on high flow O2 during that period of time, and I'm sure they did that while you were being transported to the hospital.
Yeah, they did.
Well, Doug, we appreciate everything and your discussion about this. I think it's something to bring to the forefront and be prepared for, because if we're not prepared to talking about it, we're probably not putting things in place to either prevent them from being really bad or from even happening in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the go-tos that I usually use when I'm teaching is this: if you don't recognize what you've got in front of you, you can't help anybody. And so I believe that recognition's key to this. It's not always CO. It's if you're having these symptoms and you've been exposed like our department was that day and myself, you got to be putting 2 + 2 together and always err on the side of caution.
Right.
It's a vitamin. Right. Give it.
Right.
So I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to come and tell my story. Jeff, Dr. Dunn, thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, I totally appreciate it. I think sharing stories is one of the most powerful ways we make change. So
thank you, guys.
All right, buddy. See ya. Thank you for joining us on the EMS On Air podcast. We hope everyone enjoyed this show. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And if you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform and leave us a rating and a review. Thank you, and have a great day.